Okay, thank you, Petter. You see the presentation okay now? Right, great. Okay, so we've heard several talks talking about changes in Pike now, and especially during the last 15 or 20 years or so. But one challenge for us as fish ecologists is exactly this, that we have this data of short-term changes over study species and systems, but long-term monitoring data is usually lacking, and this seems to go for pike in the Baltic Sea as well. You saw in Jens Olsson's presentation previously that for the Swedish coast, most monitoring data is from the last 20 years or so, but still we have indications of dramatic declines earlier, mostly in the 1980s and 1990s. We have good commercial catch data, but we know that it is not reliable to estimate CPUEs from this data. And this is because pike has often not been a target species in fisheries. And in many cases, it hasn't been landed at all. And the interest in pike as a species for food declined already sometime in the 1950s or 60s in Sweden. So the question we're posing here in this study is, can we use catch journals and reports from anglers to investigate the longer-term changes in pike populations? And I'll show you 3 examples of different types of angling data that we use to explore population changes over time. The first example comes from the archipelago of Öregrund, and this is right where I live, where I am now. And here we had the opportunity to digitize a large private catch journal from one single person, but it contains a fair amount of pike catches, over 2,000 pike caught in 1982 to 1998. And this is the person showing one of his larger catches, a pike above 15 kilos. And this image also illustrates how you used to treat pike. As soon as you got a large one, you wanted to bring it home to take a picture of it. Might have not have been the most sustainable way of treating large trophy fish. Yeah. So and then you also see a picture of the journal. So he really had good data on catches of each single pike he has ever caught since he was 7 years old. But we didn't get the journals all the way back, but at least from a fairly long period. We use this data set to evaluate the changes in pike size structures. So first, looking at the mean sizes of fish caught, you see that at the start of this period, the mean size was somewhere around 3.5 kilos, and then it declined quite quickly in the late 80s down to somewhere around 2 kilograms. I also added a couple of more data points here, actually from the son of this fisherman, from the exact same area, and you see that there seem to be indications of a further decline down to somewhere between 1.5 and 2 kilograms in the mean size now, and then that corresponds very well to other data sets we have too. The other measure we looked into was the proportion of large pike above 1 meter. At the start of this time series, 1 pike in 20 or so was above 100 centimeters, and then you see a really sharp drop in the early 90s, down to somewhere around 1% catch of these above 1 meter pike. Here too, we compared this data to some current data from other areas. We have a large data set from the Åland Islands, and we have a large data set from a project mostly from the Stockholm archipelago REFISC project, which you will hear more about later. And in those data sets, the share of large pike above 1 meter is around 0.3% today. So there is a really a huge change in the abundance or proportion of large pike. Right, so that was the first example. So let's get into the next one. And here we've received data from the Swedish Register of Trophy Fish. It's maintained by the Swedish Anglers Association. Here you are allowed to report catches of pike above 12 kilos if they are properly documented. And the register started in 1971. And at the coast, we have over 600 trophy pike registered so far. As you can see here in the map, most of these large pike have actually been caught around Stockholm archipelago. Just a few ones up in the Gulf of Bothnia, and then a fair share also further south along the Swedish Baltic proper coast. But most, as you see, around the Stockholm archipelago, where we really have the largest archipelago area, and also the highest density of pike fishers, I would say. So when plotting this data on the number of trophy pike, this is the pattern that appears. Coastal catches are in blue, and from inland waters in green. And you see that we had an increase in both time series, but the coastal time series peaked in the early 1990s, and then we've had a long-term decline in the number of trophy fish. In 1985, we had this open access reform, making all coastal waters open access to anglers. And we believe that there is a connection between the increase in large or trophy pike, and then later on the decline. When we look at the maximum weight of pike, sort of the same pattern appears, with a maximum weight in the early 90s at the coast, and much later in inland waters. And we believe that an alternative explanation could, of course, be that the willingness to report has declined over time, but we believe that can't really explain the early decline we see at the coast, since we have a simultaneous increase in inland waters. Right, then over to the third example. That comes from a sport fishing club in Stockholm. This was a very prestigious club with very prominent members. It was established already in 1926. The members came from the upper class, and probably because then they were the only ones who could afford to fish for recreation at that time. And they even had princes as members in this club. And these men, because they were, of course, mostly men at that time, they were very careful in a sense that they kept detailed journals of their catches, and these journals, and they published summaries of these catch journals in their yearbooks, and we've gotten hold of these yearbooks, and from those we digitized the catches. Right, and we found, if you start looking at the map, so we found long time series from 3 very good pike habitats in the inner parts of the Stockholm archipelago. The first one started already in the 1940s, and the other ones a bit later. And if you look at the data for all 3 areas together, we again see a similar pattern as in the previous series, with increases in catches up to around 1990, and then we see a sharp decline in the maximum weight. And here we were also able to look into CPUE, catches per person and day, and you see that we've had consistent declines ever since the early 1950s in CPUE. So, and the pattern that appears here is oh, sorry, right. So you didn't see that last graph. I'm sorry for that. Okay. So the pattern that appears here is that we seem to have consistent declines. We have 3 different data sets: the private catch journal, we have these yearbooks from a sport fishing club, and the register of trophy fish. And we see these consistent declines from around 1990, a few years after the reform, making all coastal waters open access to anglers. So can we then blame the anglers for these declines? So to try to shed some light on this question, we've tried to estimate how much pike is removed by the main top predators of this system. That would be ourselves and seals and cormorants. So let's start by commercial fishing. We have a downward trend starting somewhere around the 1950s. But fairly low catches overall. If we compare this to the recreational fishers, you can see quite a difference, just like Robert showed. While recreational fishers have consistently been catching more pike. The data on there are considerable uncertainties in this recreational fishing data, but the overall pattern seems to be quite clear still, that we have a strong negative trend in the landings. I would say this is not only catches, so this is the landings. And we know now that currently most of the pike caught is released, so we have a release rate which is somewhere around 80 to 90% here in this area. But it used to be fairly low, of course, previously. Okay, so let's add one of the predators, cormorants. You can see that we have a fairly wide span of these estimates, and this is because we have large uncertainties in the diet estimates. The first cormorant colonies in the Stockholm archipelago, they were established in 1994, and then we had a strong increase, and then since around 2005, the population level have been fairly constant. And they seem to be removing a fair amount of pike. Some of you might have noted that we have an awfully long y-axis here. So let's add the last one. So if we add gray seal again, just like for cormorants, you can see that we have large uncertainties in the diet estimates. But overall, we can see that during the last years, the predation from gray seal clearly exceeds the other mortality factors in these areas. So we seem to have had a shift in major removal factors from recreational fishing to seal predation over time. this image also illustrates the need for better diet information. We have used 2 different studies on diet composition for seals here. One where pike constituted 3% of the seal diet, and one where it constituted 11%. And you see, yeah, we need the better data on diet compositions to get a better grip of the of the impact of seals and cormorants. Okay, so to wrap up, these 3 examples illustrate how angling data may be used to capture population trends in a large predator fish. So the single data sets certainly include large uncertainties, but together all 3 show declines in large pike from around 1990. We believe that the initial decline is likely connected to the open access reform for angling at the coast, which was introduced in 1985. But as you remember, pike landings in angling decreased strongly and are now at a fairly low level, largely because of a shift to catch and release practices. We have also introduced a bag limit and a maximum size limit for pike. And currently, seals and cormorants remove much more pike than recreational and commercial fisheries combined, some 5 to 18 times according to our estimates. All right, thank you.